For centuries, Buddhist guides and Zen masters have highlighted something most of us overlook. Beneath our packed days, beneath our anxieties, thoughts, and endless tasks, exists a quiet that never truly leaves us. An ancient calmness waiting patiently under everything. No matter how far we wander, this peace was here before we knew how to fret, and will remain long after today's worries vanish. It's our truest and most familiar home, the one we lose and rediscover over and over throughout a lifetime. Tonight, we are heading back to that quietness. Before we start, feel free to drop a comment about what time it is and where you're listening from. In the hours to come, we'll navigate through ancient tales and peaceful wisdom, offered softly, one by one. The stillness we are returning to doesn't ask for your effort. It only requests that you pause for a brief moment and listen. So, let your shoulders relax. Let your jaw loosen. Let your breath find its own calm, unhurried pace. And whenever you're ready, let's start this gentle journey together. An old Zen saying suggests that the path home isn't a massive journey outward, but a quiet pivot inward. The Buddha stated simply that liberation from suffering can begin with something as ordinary as a single conscious breath. And so it goes with this hour we are spending together. We aren't traveling anywhere new. We are merely coming back to what has constantly been here underneath the noise of our schedules. Returning softly to the stillness that waits within us, patient as the evening. Consider for a second how chaotic a modern life can get. The never-ending lists of tasks, the anxiety over tomorrow, the constant replaying of a morning conversation, the subtle feeling, even as we lay in bed at night, that we haven't entirely caught up. We drag all of this around wherever we walk, and even when the body eventually rests, the mind keeps marching. Yet, this isn't solely the burden of our current era. Being a human on this planet has always been a demanding existence. In every generation, in every part of the globe, people have had to wake before sunrise, care for their youth, feed their loved ones, mourn their tragedies, and keep pushing forward. Life has always been overflowing, but across every age, alongside all that struggle and striving, quiet sanctuaries have existed. Tiny monasteries hidden among the trees, bamboo huts pushed back from the village dirt roads, a mountainside cave marked by a single hanging robe. Places where someone decided to step out of the rushing river of chores and simply sit down. The Buddha himself walked away from his hectic life long ago to seek out such a place. He sat under a massive tree, and what he uncovered wasn't a new religion, a new philosophy, or a strict set of rules. He discovered, very simply, that the mind has the inherent ability to return to itself, to come back home. He referred to this ability as a type of magic, not the magic of vanishing coins or colorful scarves. A softer magic, the magic hidden inside every mundane moment, just waiting to be seen. In ancient Buddhist teachings, it is believed there are two profound magics available to every human heart, two forms of quiet sorcery. The monks and nuns of the past spoke of them in whispers, not because they were secrets, but because they were sacred. The first magic is the magic of mindfulness. Mindfulness is the art of stepping back from our life just enough to realize we are actually living it. It's a tiny, brilliant shift. 1 second you are caught up in your day, tangled in the mess, believing every thought and swept away by every emotion. The very next second, without any struggle, something quietly lifts, and you notice. You realize you are here. You feel the breath moving in your body. You understand that the drama you were lost inside is, ultimately, just a story. The Buddha once instructed, master your senses, what you taste and smell, what you see and hear. In all things, be the master of what you do and say. Be mindful, be free. That is the entire teaching captured in one breath. Be mindful, be free. The second magic is the magic of love. Not romantic affection, not standard fondness, but the profound, unhurried love that ancient teachers called metta, a love that behaves more like gravity than a mere feeling, a love that softly pulls us toward belonging. just as the earth keeps the moon in its slow orbit, and the sun anchors the earth, and the ground catches every falling leaf and dropping apple. There is a gentler gravity within each of us, drawing everything together, reminding us we aren't isolated from this world we never have been. This is metta. This is the love that embraces everything. Mindfulness lets us see with clarity. Metta lets us feel with tenderness. Together, they quietly break the spell of a complicated existence. Together, they guide us back to silence. Let's dive into a tale about a traveling monk from the past who found this truth in a unique way. In an older era, when paths connecting villages were merely dirt and the mountains remained wild, there was a quiet monk who had spent decades in a forest monastery. He was a gentle spirit, soft-spoken, possessing a mind thoroughly trained in meditation, but he also held on to a small, secret joy from his youth. He was, among other roles, an amateur magician. Within the folds of his robes, he tucked a few tiny coins. In his tunic sleeve, he kept a piece of colored thread. And as he wandered through the high mountain settlements, where locals had rarely if ever encountered a traveling monk, he would greet them with a little magic. He would stroll into a village as evening approached, sit under a wide tree, and wait for the youth to gather, and they always showed up barefoot and curious, peeking out from the doors of their tiny houses. He would smile and say in a gentle tone, "Come closer, little one. I have something to show you." A courageous child would step forward, the monk would reach out delicately, and pretend to pull a small coin from behind the kid's ear. The child would gasp and whisper, "How did you do that?" While the monk would only smile, open his empty hand, and with a flick of the wrist make a second coin appear out of thin air. The rest of the kids would rush closer. The elders would pause their evening chores and turn toward the tree. The monk would juggle 3 small pebbles, make them vanish between his palms, and then pull them from behind his own ear, chuckling softly. "More," the children would plead, "do it again." And he would, because there is genuine sweetness in making a child laugh. And the monk hadn't lost that sweet nature, even after his long years of disciplined practice. One night, deep in an isolated valley where the residents had almost zero connection with the outside world, the monk walked down a steep trail as the day faded. The air carried the scent of cooking fires, rice, and burning wood. The gentle ringing of goat bells drifted up from the pastures below. Somewhere a mother sang an ancient lullaby to her child in a forgotten dialect, the kind of melody that felt older than the stones of the mountains. The monk sat under a massive tree near the village center and waited, just as he always did. The kids arrived first, followed by the women wiping hands on their aprons. Then the old men leaning heavily on their wooden sticks. The monk performed his little illusions as usual. The coin behind the ear, the vanishing pebbles, the warm chuckle when the third stone reappeared from his robe. But afterward, something unusual occurred. The villagers didn't question how he managed it. They didn't grab at his sleeves, searching for hidden coins. Instead, one after another, they stood up and started imitating him. They lifted their hands exactly as he had lifted his. They tilted their heads just like him. They mimicked the exact gentle movement he used right before the coin showed up behind the child's ear. An elderly woman among the crowd, her face lined with age, stepped up to the monk and spoke softly. "Teacher," she murmured, "we do not know the words you whisper to the spirits. Will you teach us?" The monk sat in silence for a long moment. He felt a slow, rising wave of tenderness in his chest as he realized these people weren't trying to figure out a trick. They believed they had witnessed an event beyond their comprehension, and they were, in their own quiet manner, asking for that mystery to touch their lives too. That night, as the stars illuminated the peaks, the monk sat under his tree, unable to sleep. He pondered the coin behind the ear. He thought about the gestures the villagers mimicked, and he remembered a lesson his old master had taught him years ago in the silent monastery. There is only one magic that actually matters, my young friend, his teacher had told him. The rest is just sleight of hand. The monk hadn't fully grasped those words back then. He had been young and quietly arrogant about his quick skills, but sitting there under the night sky, accompanied by these humble people, he finally got it. The coin tricks, the juggled pebbles, these were just minor entertainments, pleasant but trivial. The true magic, the kind that could transform a human existence, wasn't held in the hands, it was housed in the heart. It was the magic of a mind that had found its way back to itself, the magic of awareness, the magic of love. Decades later, as an elderly man, he no longer kept coins in his pockets. He carried nothing but silence. And when kids crowded around him, as they always did, he didn't pull anything from their ears. He simply sat beside them, breathed and smiled. And somehow, those children still went home, feeling they had witnessed something completely wonderful. This is the very magic we're trying to practice in our own way in the stillness of tonight. It's so basic that we constantly overlook it. It doesn't demand that we travel. It doesn't require us to master a new dialect or seek out a guru. It only asks us to noticito, repeatedly return to the breath flowing through our bodies, to tune back into the subtle noises in the room, the heat of the blanket, the gentle weight of our hands resting in our laps. In the Zen tradition, there is a famous saying, before awakening, chopping wood, carrying water. After awakening, chopping wood, carrying water. The daily grind doesn't change, the tasks remain. The kettle still requires filling, the floor still requires sweeping, but the person performing the tasks has, somewhere along the journey, quietly returned home. As the mind starts to calm down and the body begins to relax, time itself seems to unravel. The clock on the wall continues its ticking, yet the observer within us becomes completely still. There is less sprinting forward into the future and less dragging back into the past. There is nothing but this exact moment, this specific breath, and the soft realization that the silence we sought was never anywhere else. It was merely waiting for us to pause long enough to notice it. The Buddha shared this lesson using his own plain words. "Are you quiet?" he inquired. "Quiet your body, quiet your mind. Awaken yourself. Observe clearly how things truly are, and live with joy and freedom right here and right now, right here and now. Not somewhere else, not later on, just here." Therefore, the two profound magics, mindfulness and love, aren't powers we need to somehow obtain. They aren't skills we have to refine over decades. They already belong to us. They have always belonged to us. They are the profound inheritance of simply being human. The silent birthright that no existence, regardless of how frantic, can ever genuinely strip away. All that is requested of us is to pay attention. So, if you wish, you could try something incredibly minor. As we proceed together on the very next breath, just observe that you are breathing. You don't need to alter the breath. You don't need to make it slower or force it to be deeper. You solely need to notice it. And through that tiny act of observation, a bit of magic has already occurred. The observer is already standing right at the threshold of liberation. Already, a fraction of the illusion has faded. Already, a piece of the silence has returned to its home. This is sufficient. It is always enough. Let's take a brief pause. Observe how you are feeling right now, and whenever you are ready, we will move forward together. The Buddha explained that the route to awakening isn't detached from the mundane moments of our existence. It is interlaced right through them. Walking is a practice. Eating is a practice. Sweeping the floor is a practice. Cradling a drowsy child at night is a practice. The silent care for whatever lies right in front of us, using an open and tender heart, gradually becomes the entire journey. The majority of us are raised to believe that life's profoundest layers can only be discovered if we withdraw from society, that we have to journey somewhere distant or locate a unique guru, or sit inside a flawless room of absolute quiet. And certainly, when we are able to step back, it is a tremendous gift. Going on retreat is a wonderful experience. The Buddha himself sat alone under a tree for countless days and nights prior to his awakening. However, the Zen and Buddhist teachers who followed him quickly reminded us of a much softer truth. They taught that the exact life we are currently experiencing is the true field of awakening. The specific events we never planned for, the unexpected forks in the road we wouldn't have picked, can become the fertile soil where genuine wisdom blossoms, if we face them gently. Most of us, whenever an unforeseen event enters our life, treat it as a disruption. A new burden drops in. Someone we care about requires more of our attention. A peaceful plan we made for ourselves is pushed aside, and deep down we think, this is dragging me away from my actual life. This is preventing me from doing what I was truly meant to do. The Buddha, displaying immense kindness, presented a different perspective. He stated that the present moment, exactly as it stands, is the doorway itself, not the existence we had fantasized about, not the future we've been preparing for. This very one, complete with all its minor surprises, is the life where awakening actually becomes possible. There is a gorgeous ancient Buddhist tale that conveys this lesson far better than any lecture ever could. Let's sit with it for a moment. Let's delve into a story about two young instructors who lived ages ago in a modest nunnery tucked inside a peaceful valley surrounded by green hills. They were recognized across their entire region as women of exceptional wisdom. The older of the pair, a softly spoken woman with contemplative eyes, had grown into one of the most esteemed scholars of the Buddha's teachings in her homeland. She had examined the ancient texts for years, memorizing lengthy passages, studying alongside old masters, and waking up before sunrise to read by the soft glow of an oil lamp. Her beloved companion, a woman just a year or two younger, was equally a scholar of immense promise. Together, they had arranged to journey that specific season to a secluded mountain hermitage to enhance their silent meditation for at least a year. Their modest cloth bags were all packed up. The trail leading up the mountain was waiting for them. But then one year a massive storm tore through the valley. The rains fell heavily and the winds howled fiercely. The locals in the valley were resilient as well, and in the following days, they began to reconstruct their community together. However, numerous families had to relocate to temporary shelters while their own houses underwent repairs. Life was subtly shifting all around. One night, the elders from the neighboring villages arrived at the nunnery with a humble plea. Standing at the gate with their hands clasped, an old man spoke up. "Sisters," he began, "there are 18 young girls who desperately need a stable, caring place to stay while their families get back on their feet. Would you be willing to open your doors to them, merely for a season, just until things stabilize once more?" The two young women exchanged a glance. Their mountain sanctuary was waiting for them. The profound silence they had prepared for over so many years was waiting. The younger sister was the first to speak. "Of course," she replied, and her companion nodded with a smile, echoing, "Of course." The children showed up the very next morning, marching down the trail in a quiet, single file. The youngest was a mere 5 years old, while the oldest was nearly 13. A few were timid, taking cover behind the skirts of the older ones. Others were quite bold, already inquiring about where they would sleep, and if rice would be served for dinner. Some walked in complete silence with wide, observant eyes. The two instructors smiled warmly at each of them and knelt down to welcome them at eye level. "Welcome home," the older sister stated. As the seasons changed, the girls ended up staying far longer than anyone had anticipated. One season turned into two. Two morphed into a full year, and that year stretched into many years. The two young teachers constructed a modest hall out of bamboo and woven palm leaves using their own hands. They prepared rice in massive clay pots. They instructed the girls on how to read the ancient texts. They taught them soft chants to sing at sunrise. They braided their hair every morning, They wiped away afternoon tears. They sang ancient lullabies in the evenings until little heads rested against tiny shoulders, and the hall was filled with the gentle, rhythmic breathing of sleep. The days developed their own peaceful rhythm. In the early dawn light, the girls swept the dirt floors with little straw brooms, sharing soft laughter among themselves. By midday, they sat in a circle, learning to trace ancient letters on wax tablets. The youngest gripped their reed styluses with intense focus and stubborn, crooked fingers. During the late afternoons, the two instructors would sit under the large tree outside the hall, reading aloud from the Buddhist scriptures. The girls draped over one another like drowsy kittens, whether they were actively listening or not, absorbing the lessons all the same. On balmy nights, when the cicadas started their songs and the first stars emerged, the elder sister would often sit on the hall steps with a child curled against her side, gently stroking her hair in absolute silence. Watching this from across the courtyard, the younger sister would experience a profound and tranquil happiness, a joy that was completely disconnected from mountains, retreats, or ancient scriptures. A happiness that simply blossomed from being exactly where she was meant to be. One peaceful afternoon, a traveler from a distant country arrived to visit the nunnery. Having heard tales of the remarkable warmth of these two young teachers, he desired to spend an afternoon in their company. He offered a modest gift of cloth-wrapped tea, and they graciously welcomed him into their simple hall. They conversed about the Buddha's teachings. They discussed the true nature of kindness, and at one point, deeply moved by his surroundings, the traveler asked a question he intended to be sympathetic. "Dear sisters," he inquired gently, "do you ever feel sorrow for what you had to set aside? You were en route to a magnificent mountain retreat. You had dedicated countless years to studying the scriptures. You possessed the potential to become some of the greatest teachers of your generation. Do you ever regret that you aren't currently practicing as you originally planned?" The two women looked at him for a long while. Their expressions remained soft, yet held a hint of quiet amusement, as if his question was slightly baffling. The elder sister smiled first. "Not practicing?" she asked softly. "What do you mean, not practicing?" The traveler hesitated, unsure of how to reply. The younger sister reached out and placed a tender hand on his arm. "The Buddha has sent us these 18 girls," she said. "What an incredibly beautiful practice it is." Right as she spoke those words, a little girl with bright pigtails dashed across the floor, flung her arms around the young teacher's waist, and laughed while hiding her face in the folds of the robe. The teacher laughed along and rested her hand on the girl's head, never breaking her warm gaze from the traveler. "This one," she added affectionately, "has been my teacher for 7 years now. She is incredibly strict. She reminds me to be patient every single day." The little girl giggled and sprinted away. The traveler sat there perfectly still. He had arrived expecting to find exhausted women who had sacrificed their dreams. Instead, he discovered 2 radiant beings surrounded by a vibrant, living garden of growing souls, exuding the exact essence he had spent his whole life searching for, without knowing its name. Later, as he walked away down the path from the nunnery, the late afternoon sun filtered through the trees. A soft breeze rustled the branches above him, and he finally understood in a way he never had before, that practice was never located somewhere else. It wasn't in the retreat he longed for, or the special guru he sought, or the flawless silence he imagined waiting in the mountains. Practice had always been found in what was currently given. This is the quiet core of the Buddha's message. The life we currently have is the exact life we are meant to practice with, not the life we wish for, nor the life we are waiting to begin, just this one. There's a verse in the Dhammapada, a beloved collection of the Buddha's sayings, that goes something like this: "Live in joy, in love, even among those who are deeply troubled. Live in health, in peace, even among those who are suffering. Look inward, become still, liberated from fear and constant grasping. Come to realize the sweet joy of living fully in the way. There is a vast spaciousness within these words if we allow ourselves to truly feel them. The Buddha isn't telling us to wait until the world around us becomes gentler before we can experience peace. He is stating that peace is already present beneath the unexpected events, beneath the altered plans, and underneath the things we never asked for. For most of us, when life shifts in an unchosen direction, we feel a tight knot form somewhere inside. We tell ourselves, "This isn't what I wanted. This isn't how things were supposed to go." We resist, and in our resistance we frequently miss the exact lesson that has arrived to teach us. However, the two young teachers in that old story demonstrate an alternative path. They show us that when life changes abruptly, we have the ability to pause, we can breathe, we can gently observe what has shown up at our doorstep, and we can pose a much kinder question. Rather than asking, "Why is this happening?" we might ask, "What is actually here?" Instead of wondering when it will finally end, we can ask, "Who will I become if I navigate this with gentleness?" In Zen history, there is a beautiful old tale about a young monk who once asked his master, "What exactly is the way?" His master answered plainly, "Your everyday life, that is the way." The young student was completely puzzled. He had anticipated something magnificent, a hidden secret reserved only for those who had traveled great distances and studied for decades. Yet his teacher was quietly handing him the entire truth. Washing the dishes is the way. Taking care of an aging parent is the way. Sitting patiently beside a restless child is the way. These small, unglamorous moments, strung one after another, are the temple itself. They are the true retreat. They are the path. We don't have to journey anywhere to discover the core of the Buddha's lessons. We merely need to turn a softer gaze toward whatever is already right in front of us. And if something unplanned has recently landed in your life, a minor change or a quiet new burden, perhaps the tale of the two young teachers and those 18 girls can keep you company for a bit. Perhaps it can gently whisper that whatever has arrived isn't pulling you away from your actual life. It is your actual life. And it might be presenting you with something that couldn't possibly be found any other way. Let's rest here for just a breath. Allow that story to settle wherever it needs to within your heart. When you feel ready, we will continue walking together. The Buddha once described our mundane experience using a simple yet startling word. He called it a dream. Not the kind we have while sleeping, but the dream of the waking day, that quiet fog of thoughts, memories, agendas, and anxieties that drifts through the mind from the second our eyes open until we lay our heads back down to rest. We exist inside this dream for nearly every moment of our lives. And as the Buddha gently noted, most of us don't even realize we are dreaming yet. There is a highly cherished old story about the Buddha himself. Shortly after his awakening beneath the massive fig tree, a few travelers encountered him on the road and paused. They detected something extraordinary about this tranquil man sitting cross-legged by the dirt path. One of them inquired, "Are you a god?" Another asked, "Are you a powerful teacher, or some kind of forest spirit?" Smiling gently, the Buddha responded with a single word. He declared, "I am awake." That individual word rests at the very core of the Buddhist journey. Not merely awake in the physical sense of having open eyes, but awake in the sense of observing, with clear and tender focus, what is genuinely unfolding within our own hearts and minds. Most of us recognize this feeling, even if we have never managed to put it into words. You might be walking home along a familiar route, reach your front door, and suddenly realize you can't recall a single moment of the walk. The streets blurred by, the turns were made, and your body kept moving without you. Where exactly was your mind during all those steps? Or you are sitting at the dinner table with a loved one as they recount their day. Your face is angled toward them, and your head nods at all the appropriate moments. And yet, A part of you is miles away, already mapping out your next sentence or replaying a worry from that morning. When they finally pause and look into your eyes, you realize with a twinge of tenderness that you haven't genuinely listened to them for several minutes. They were present, you were physically there, but somehow you weren't fully in the room. This is the exact dream the Buddha was referring to. It is nothing mystical or exotic, it is simply this: the subtle way the mind wanders off into its own narratives and its lengthy, convincing dramas, all while the actual reality of the moment rushes right past us. Buddhist and Zen masters have always maintained a gentle approach toward this tendency. They never scolded anyone for getting lost inside their own thoughts. They observed, with immense compassion, that the mind naturally behaves this way. It is simply what minds do. Just as hearts beat and lungs breathe, minds weave stories. It is its inherent nature. What the ancient Buddhist guides pointed out repeatedly wasn't the mere fact that we dream. It was the beautiful potential that we can, at any given moment, wake up, not completely and not forever. Just a tiny bit, just for this single breath. And then perhaps for the next one as well. The entire path is quietly constructed from these minor moments of awakening, stacked one upon another, softly transforming everything. Let's delve into a tale about a quiet farmer who, late in his years, finally sat down to watch a shadow play. He was a notoriously hard-working man, famous throughout his village for his constant busyness. His fields were always tended to. His livestock was well fed, and his roof was patched the very second a leak showed up. But throughout all his years, he had never once taken a seat to enjoy the traveling storytellers who visited his village every few seasons. The performers who erected white cloth screens in the village square, projecting ancient tales through light and shadow deep into the warm summer nights. "What is the point?" he would scoff, waving a dismissive hand. "They are merely shadows. None of it is real." His wife would just smile softly at him and attend the shows without him. However, during the late summer of one specific year, something inside him felt quieter than normal. His kids had grown up. His fields were resting between seasonal harvests. And he noticed that his own body had slowed down with age. When the storyteller rolled into town one balmy evening, his wife gently grabbed his hand and said, "Come sit with me tonight just for this one time." And for the first time, he agreed. The village square was already packed when they got there. A soft blue twilight was settling over the rooftops. The aroma of cooking fires wafted from nearby houses, and the evening carried that specific quietness that arrives when the day's labor is finally done. Young kids sat cross-legged near the front row, whispering among themselves. Elderly men leaned on the low stone walls behind the wooden benches, while young parents held babies against their shoulders, swaying rhythmically. The hard-working farmer and his wife secured a spot on a bench alongside the other villagers. The oil lamp behind the white screen was ignited, and the storyteller, possessing a deep and unhurried voice, started his tale. The shadows danced. First appeared the silhouette of a young wanderer trekking across a vast plain. Then emerged the figure of an ancient sage sitting cross-legged under a wide tree, followed by the shape of a gentle deer walking cautiously through a twilight forest. The storyteller's tone rose and fell dramatically. The flame flickered, caused the shadows to shift and leap across the fabric. The farmer, who had previously dismissed such foolishness, suddenly found himself leaning forward in anticipation. The wanderer was lost. The old sage was patiently waiting. The deer observed from the tree line, its ears perked up. Something deep inside the farmer's chest tightened and then released. He completely forgot about his hands resting on his own knees. He forgot the hard wooden bench beneath him. And he even forgot the gentle breathing of his wife sitting right beside him. He was traveling with the wanderer now, crossing that vast plain. He became the wanderer, lost, exhausted, and searching. When the tired wanderer finally located the sage under the tree and knelt down, the farmer realized, to his absolute shock, that his own eyes were filled with tears. The performance lasted roughly an hour. When it wrapped up, the crowd clapped softly, the kind of applause people give when they've been deeply moved and don't want to break the spell. Then, honoring an old local tradition, the storyteller stepped out from behind his setup to take a bow. He carefully lowered the white cloth. Because children were watching, he revealed the oil lamp and demonstrated how simple wooden puppets attached to thin sticks cast the shadow, showing how a tiny flame and skilled hands could conjure an entire universe. The farmer observed this extremely closely. He watched the man pick up the puppet of the young wanderer. It was small and plain, just a flat piece of carved wood painted with a few dull colors. He watched the performer rotate the puppet in his grip. From a specific angle, it looked exactly like the weary wanderer on the plain. But from another angle, it was simply a stick of wood. He stared at the lamp, realizing it was merely a lamp. A bizarre sensation washed over him right then, a profound, quiet astonishment. For the whole evening, his heart had journeyed alongside that wanderer. His breathing had hitched and released in suspense. His eyes had brimmed with tears. Yet the entire time, it had been nothing more than shadows thrown by a tiny fire and a handful of carved wooden shapes. It was strictly light, shapes, and a voice. He walked home at a slow pace with his wife that night, barely speaking a word. The stars were appearing over the dark fields one after another, and the village was drifting off to sleep. A hushed breeze rustled the tall grasses. Far off in the distance, a dog barked once and then fell silent. "What did you think of it?" his wife finally asked, her tone warm. The farmer remained silent for a good while. He was contemplating all the decades he had spent trapped inside his own anxieties, his meticulous plans, and his constant replay of conversations, both said and unsaid, all the moments his chest had clenched in stress, over things he couldn't even remember anymore. All the countless times his mind had been miles away from where his physical feet were planted. "I think," he murmured at last, "that my own mind has been projecting shadows for my entire life." His wife glanced at him in surprise. "And I have been crying over them," he added softly, treating them as if they were perfectly real. She reached out to grab his hand as they strolled, choosing not to say another word. Sometimes the most profound epiphanies arrive wrapped in silence. Sometimes the absolute kindest action is simply walking beside someone who is finally beginning to see the truth. They arrived at their modest house. He stopped at the threshold and gazed up at the starry sky for a second longer than he normally would. Then he stepped inside, lay down in his bed, and slept more peacefully than he had in decades. This is the exact quiet realization the Buddha was pointing toward ages ago, beneath his massive tree. The thoughts that drift through our minds are certainly real in their own specific way. They pop up, and they move us emotionally. They can make us chuckle, trigger our worries, or fill us with wonder. However, they are not the solid, unshakable truths we frequently mistake them for. They are much closer to those shadows on the cloth screencast by the soft lamp of our awareness, shifting and dancing with every tiny flicker of our attention. The problem isn't the fact that we have thoughts. The issue, if we must call it that, is that we constantly forget that our thoughts are merely thoughts. We accept them as absolute, breaking news regarding who we are as people, who others are, and how the world must definitely operate. And so we grow tense, we fight against whatever is occurring inside our own heads, we shed tears over empty shadows, but at any given second, without making a big fuss about it, we have the power to remember. We can simply note, here is a thought regarding tomorrow, a thought about a comment someone made. It is strictly a thought. Here is an emotion, a surge of worry, a wave of restlessness, a sudden spike of tenderness for no logical reason. It is merely a feeling. When we remember this fact, even for a split second, We don't magically erase the thoughts or feelings. The shadows will keep dancing on the screen, but a crucial shift occurs. We remember that we are the audience watching the show. We remember the existence of the lamp. We recall the soft, quiet space existing right behind the fabric. The Buddha once provided a soothing analogy for this specific way of observing. He explained that a highly disciplined mind acts much like a motionless pool of water on a crisp morning. Everything moving around the water is perfectly reflected on its surface, yet the pool itself stays entirely undisturbed. The surrounding trees are reflected, flying birds are reflected, drifting clouds are captured, and the water holds onto all these images without desperately grasping them, and without rejecting any of them. This profound stillness isn't some distant achievement. It is our own inherent mind resting beneath the constant shadow play. It is already present, already embedded inside us, quietly holding out for us to simply notice. And the moment we do notice, even just for the duration of one breath, a softening happens. The tight grip of our internal narrative begins to loosen. Our shoulders drop just a fraction. Our physical body remembers its actual location. We re-enter the very room that we never actually departed from, the mug of tea resting on the table, the ambient sounds of the evening outside, the physical warmth of our own hands. All of these things become entirely real once again, simply because we are finally present to meet them. Zen masters occasionally describe this state as arriving back home without ever having left in the first place. It's an unusual but beautiful phrase when you sit and ponder it. We were never genuinely lost at all. We had merely forgotten, for a brief period, exactly where we were standing, and the exact second we remember, we are already back home. There is absolutely no requirement to silence the internal stories. They are going to continue whether we want them to or not. And a lot of them are quite lovely, a few are genuinely important, but the vast majority are simply tourists passing through. We just need to remind ourselves, every so often, that we are the silent observer watching the show. And through that tiny, compassionate act of remembering, a little ray of light re-enters the room of our existence. A little bit of silence flows back into the heart, and a tiny fragment of the daily dream begins to gently lift away. Let's settle into this thought for a moment. Let your breathing remain exactly as it is. There is no rush whatsoever. Whenever it feels appropriate, we'll continue our journey. There is a specific sensation most of us have experienced, even if we rarely discuss it. A particular quietness that occasionally shows up completely uninvited. Like standing alone in the kitchen in the early morning hours, before the rest of the house wakes up, or taking a solo walk down a highly familiar trail as the day comes to a close, or sitting quietly beside a close friend when the conversation naturally dips into a comfortable silence. During those brief moments, a more profound silence blossoms inside us. And for just the length of a breath, we feel as if we've finally come home to something familiar. But then the moment evaporates. The external world comes rushing back with its loud noises and endless petty chores. The peaceful silence appears to slip right through our fingers, and we catch ourselves thinking, if I could only return there, if only I could linger inside that quiet space a little bit longer. The Buddha, along with the Zen masters who followed his path, would likely smile softly at such a thought. They would present us with a concept that, at first glance, is quite difficult to swallow. They would argue that the silence never truly left. It remains right here. It has always remained right here. We are actually the ones constantly wandering away from it, only to turn around and wonder where it vanished to. Ancient Buddhist traditions have a gentle label for this concealed quietness. They refer to it as our original mind. It is the soft, lingering presence resting beneath the endless chatter of our daily thoughts. It is not a structure we have to painstakingly construct, the way a potter molds a clay pot, nor is it a reward we have to earn, the way a merchant works for a coin. It is already fully present. We are already immersed inside it. We are swimming through it, exactly like a fish swims through water, largely without ever noticing. For a second, a very early morning before the street outside your window has entirely woken up, and before the local birds have wrapped up their initial morning songs. There is a distinct hush covering the world during that specific hour. It wasn't manufactured by anyone, it is just inherently there. When we step out into that quiet, we don't have to build it. We merely realize that it has been patiently waiting for us the entire time. The Buddha once delivered a remarkable piece of wisdom to one of his followers. This student had been practicing diligently for years, searching desperately for awakening, treating each day like a grueling climb toward a faraway mountain peak. One afternoon, the exhausted and slightly defeated student turned to the Buddha and asked, "Master, how much further do I have to go? How long until I finally arrive?" The Buddha, with incredible tenderness, replied, "You are already standing right on top of it. Let's explore an old story about a young seeker from a bygone era who departed his modest home in search of a renowned Zen master residing deep in the distant mountains. He had been raised in a peaceful village, living in a basic wooden house featuring a tiny courtyard, a water well, a short bench, and a solitary plum tree standing by the front gate. He was a deeply contemplative young man, brimming with profound questions. What exactly is silence? Where does true peace originate? What is the genuine nature of this mind that I drag around with me everywhere? Whenever he posed these questions to his elders, they would simply offer a gentle smile and reply, "Those are excellent inquiries. Maybe you ought to travel and find a worthy teacher." So he packed a tiny sack, grabbing a bit of rice, some spare cloth, a lone wooden bowl, and a walking stick carved by his grandfather. He began his trek toward the high peaks, where an ancient Zen master allegedly resided in a hermitage bordering a vast pine forest. His expedition spanned multiple seasons. He traversed sweeping plains where tall grasses danced in the wind. He trekked along tranquil rivers, spotting herons standing motionless among the tall reeds. He rested beneath roadside shelters and was taken in by generous strangers who offered him portions of their rice and shared their personal tales. His frame grew leaner, his beard lengthened, and his eyes took on an older, more weathered look. Finally, during the late autumn of a particular year, he reached the base of an immense mountain. He inquired with the local villagers about the master, and they directed him toward a steep, twisting trail. "He is up there," they confirmed, "but he is quite eccentric. Don't be shocked by whatever he tells you." The seeker hiked for a full day and night. The atmosphere thinned out, the pine trees towered above, and he eventually stumbled into a modest clearing housing a tiny cabin, with faint smoke drifting up from its stone chimney. He dropped to his knees in front of the door and waited. After a considerable amount of time, the wooden door creaked open, revealing the master. He was a petite, round-faced elder possessing vibrant eyes and remarkably calm hands. He stared at the exhausted seeker for what seemed like an eternity. "Why exactly are you here?" the master eventually asked. "Master," the young man replied, his voice quivering slightly with emotion, "I have journeyed from incredibly far away. I've spent countless seasons trying to locate you. I desperately want to comprehend the mind's silence. I want to experience the profound peace the Buddha described. Please instruct me." The master gazed down at him with a look of fond amusement. "Go back home," he instructed. The seeker blinked in confusion. "I apologize, Master, I don't believe I heard you right." "Go back home," the master repeated, his tone even softer this time. "Whatever it is you are hunting for, it does not exist here." "But master," the seeker pleaded, "I have traveled such a massive distance. I abandoned everything I knew. You must be able to teach me a little something. There has to be a specific method, a daily practice, or a secret you can hand me." The old man smiled, reaching out to gently rest a hand on the young man's shoulder. "The sole secret I can offer you," he murmured, "is that you are already carrying it within you. Go back home, sit quietly in your own courtyard. Sip tea from your own personal cup. Gaze at the plum tree standing by your own front gate. The exact silence you are hunting for is waiting right there. It has been patiently waiting for your entire existence." And with those words, the master offered a slight bow, retreated into his tiny cabin, and shut the door. The young seeker remained frozen there for a lengthy period, entirely unsure of his next move. He had sacrificed multiple seasons to this journey. He had rested his head in unfamiliar, uncomfortable locations. He had completely worn through the bottoms of his shoes. He had lugged around burning questions in his heart that only felt heavier with each passing year. And now, the legendary teacher he had idolized for so long had casually ordered him to turn around and go home. Initially, while hiking back down the steep trail, the seeker was furious. Then his anger melted into utter confusion. Then a deep exhaustion set in. Finally, after weeks of putting one foot in front of the other, he simply became quiet. By the time his own tiny village finally came into view, several more seasons had slipped away. His residence looked exactly the way he had left it. The plum tree remained by the entrance. The wooden bench sat faithfully next to the front door. The simple clay mug he had used since childhood was still resting on a low interior shelf. An elderly neighbor spotted him trudging down the dirt lane and offered a wave. "You've been away for quite a while," she called out cheerfully. "Did you manage to find what you were hunting for?" The seeker offered a weary smile. "I'm not entirely certain yet, grandmother. Check back with me tomorrow." He took a step into his courtyard, and suddenly something shifted. He lowered himself onto the weathered wooden bench. Gazing at the plum tree, he observed tiny white blossoms blooming along its limbs. He caught the faint buzzing of a solitary bee navigating the petals. He absorbed the gentle heat of the late afternoon sunlight warming the backs of his hands. The stone tiles under his boots were the exact same ones he had skipped across thousands of times during his childhood. The water well in the corner produced the identical faint creak it always did whenever a breeze rattled its wooden crank. A lone white butterfly fluttered up from the rim of a flower pot, gliding lazily across the space as if it had been patiently anticipating his return. And suddenly, without any grand announcement, an immense stillness blossomed within his chest. It wasn't the result of any specific action. He hadn't recited a single mantra. He hadn't even shut his eyes in formal meditation. He had just taken a seat in his very own courtyard and inhaled a gentle breath. And that silence unfolded like a tightly wound flower bud that had been closed for years, yet had never, not even for a second, stopped being a flower. He started to cry softly, overwhelmed by a sense of quiet awe. The old mountain master had spoken the absolute truth. The silence had resided here the entire time. It was present the very day he packed his little bag with such grim determination. It accompanied him throughout his entire expedition while scaling peaks and fording streams desperately, hunting for a treasure already tucked inside his own pocket. It was there the exact afternoon he dropped to his knees outside the hermit's door. It had existed in every passing second without a single pause, requiring absolutely zero effort on his part. He simply hadn't been calm enough to recognize it. Early the following morning, the elderly neighbor appeared at his gate, carrying a steaming bowl of porridge, honoring the village tradition for welcoming home-weary travelers. "So," she asked with a grin, "did you track down what you were seeking?" The young man accepted the bowl with both hands and offered a slight, respectful bow. "I certainly did, grandmother," he replied. "Just not in the location I traveled to." She gave a knowing nod, as if she had been aware of this fact the entire time, and turned to stroll back up the dirt path. This represents one of the most endearing secrets that Zen and Buddhist lineages have quietly handed down for millennia. The peace we ache for isn't actively hiding from us. It sits closer to us than our next breath, nearer than the beating of our own hearts. It is the serene presence lingering beneath all our strategizing, all our daydreaming, and all our physical wandering. And it is already perfectly whole. We don't need to book a journey to locate it. We merely need to halt for a split second and realize it never left. The Buddha illustrated this using a very basic metaphor. He explained, "Our core awareness operates much like a clear blue sky. Thoughts drift back and forth across it. Dark clouds of anxiety, fluffy clouds of nostalgia, thin clouds of future planning. However, the sky itself endures. It never actually transforms into the clouds. It doesn't cease to exist just because a storm rolls in. It remains that identical, expansive, tranquil sky, regardless of what floats through it. Occasionally the cloud cover gets extremely dense, and we completely forget the sky even exists. We become convinced that the stormy clouds are the only reality. But the sky hasn't relocated. The exact second we remember to peer beyond the overcast layer, we witness it looking precisely as it always has. There is a comforting tenderness wrapped in this idea. It implies that we haven't actually been failing all these decades when our minds felt overcrowded and exhausted. The clear sky was never truly lost. It was just temporarily obscured from our vision. And the act of remembering it is incredibly gentle. It requires no dramatic flair, no intense preparation, just a mild internal pivot, a simple upward glance, and suddenly the stars reappear above us, steadfast and shining, exactly as they have been since the beginning of time. This also signifies that we have never genuinely been isolated. The identical silence that kept us company during childhood remains by our side today. The peaceful presence that embraced us during our very first inhale is still holding us right now. It is vastly older than any anxiety we've ever managed to invent. It is broader than any ambition we have ever sketched out, and it is much closer than any object we've ever traveled to find tonight. As you absorb these words, you are already resting inside that exact quietness. You might sense it distinctly, or perhaps you don't. Honestly, it makes no true difference. This silence doesn't demand your active belief to exist. It is simply resting gently underneath the surface, waiting without a shred of impatience. You haven't actually strayed far from home at all. You've merely spent some time gazing in the wrong direction, and now, during this peaceful hour, you are gently rotating back around. Let's take a collective pause right here. Allow your physical form to rest. Let your inhales and exhales slow down. Whenever the timing feels correct, we shall proceed. The Buddha frequently delivered his teachings by referencing small, mundane objects. He would gesture toward a scoop of uncooked rice, a battered leather sandal, or a community well baking in the midday sun. He understood, just as later Zen masters would constantly remind, that the most profound wisdom is generally concealed within the most basic actions. And among all these basic actions, perhaps the most quietly brilliant is the act of tending. To tend means to look after something without aggressively rushing its progress, to offer your presence without demanding control, to guard something with relaxed, open palms rather than a clenched fist. A mother tends to her dreaming infant. A botanist tends to a flower bed. A chef tends to a gently boiling broth. A companion tends to a dear friend's grief. Not by aggressively trying to fix it, but by remaining physically close while the emotion naturally runs its course. Ancient Buddhist instructors referred to this soft trait as wise, affectionate attention. They utilized a specific phrase for it, preserved for over 2 millennia in the original scriptures. It translates to an attention infused with tenderness, an attention that actively creates space, an attention that refuses to tightly grab or forcefully shove. This is the specific brand of attention that subtly transforms a human life. The majority of us, when initially attempting to explore the calmer sectors of our existence, treat them exactly the way we've been conditioned to handle everything else. We attempt to repair them, We strive to optimize them. We endeavor to conquer them. We show up to our meditation cushion, or to our relaxing evening at home, or to an intimate conversation, hauling along the identical, aggressive energy we utilize during our workday, and we frequently discover, much to our shock, that aggressive energy completely fails in this arena. When we squeeze a peaceful moment too tightly, the peace instantly evaporates. When we physically wrestle with our own thoughts, attempting to banish them, they merely multiply in strength. Whenever we command ourselves to relax, we immediately tense up. There is a specific element within our internal landscape that simply refuses to be bullied or bossed around. It can solely be invited in, and that very invitation is the delicate art of tending. Within Zen philosophy, there's a lovely proverb stating that the human heart and mind resemble a tiny wild bird. If you aggressively lunge to trap it in your fist, it will panic and fly off. However, if you remain incredibly still with an open palm, presenting a tiny offering of seeds, it might approach entirely on its own terms and comfortably perch beside you for a spell. Let's dive into a tale about an elderly gardener and her little granddaughter who shared a lengthy summer, mastering the delicate practice of tending to nature. The grandmother was a woman who carried many peaceful decades behind her. She resided in a modest stone cabin on the outskirts of town, boasting a massive backyard garden overflowing with fragrant herbs, ripe vegetables, and creeping vines. She had been cultivating and nurturing that exact plot of dirt for more years than her young granddaughter had even existed. Local neighbors would frequently pause at her fence, just to admire the view. Because her yard felt almost enchanted, the crops looked genuinely thrilled just to be planted there. Her granddaughter, arriving for an extended summer visit, was a sharp, enthusiastic kid around 8 or 9, bursting with boundless energy and endless inquiries. More than anything else in the world, she desired to assist her grandmother in the dirt. On the very first morning of her trip, she sprinted into the yard, clutching a miniature wooden pail and a little spade. "Grandma, what's the plan? What are we going to bury in the dirt?" "Can I start planting seeds right this second?" The older woman simply smiled, methodically wiping her soiled hands on her faded apron. "Let's just take a stroll through the beds first," she suggested. "Let's observe what is already growing." So, they slowly meandered down the neat rows side by side. The grandmother pointed out the basil patches, snapping off a single green leaf to let the young girl inhale its sharp, sweet aroma. She pointed toward the towering, heavy tomato vines. She directed the girl's attention to the tiny, spiraling tendrils of a beanstalk scaling a wooden pole together. They squatted in the dirt to inspect a line of baby lettuce sprouts, so miniature they looked as fragile as a breath. "These guys are incredibly young," the grandmother noted. "We are going to tend to them today." The young girl frowned in confusion. "But what exactly are we going to do to them, Grandma?" "For the most part, we are just going to look at them," the older woman replied with a grin. "We'll offer them a tiny sip of water if the soil is dry. We'll pluck any little weeds that are creeping in too tightly, and after that, we will completely leave them alone." "That's it?" the child asked. "That's it?" her grandmother confirmed. "That is what gardening actually is." The kid appeared visibly underwhelmed. She had fantasized about something much more epic. She pictured herself shoveling massive mounds of dirt, lugging heavy watering cans, and heroically burying endless lines of seeds. She certainly had envisioned this passive, silent observation. However, she was a respectful kid who deeply trusted her elder. Thus, she pitched in exactly where she was instructed and quietly observed exactly what she was told to observe. As a few days dragged by, the little girl's patience wore thin. She wanted the tiny sprouts to shoot up. She wanted the green tomatoes to instantly blood red. During one particularly warm afternoon, she caught herself hovering directly over the baby lettuce, whispering in an incredibly stern tone, "Hurry up. Seriously, grow faster." Her grandmother, approaching quietly from behind, let out a soft chuckle. "Sweetheart, what exactly are you up to?" "I'm trying to help them grow faster, Grandma." The old woman lowered herself onto a flat garden stone bordering the lettuce patch and patted the dirt right beside her. The child plopped down. "Would you like to hear a tiny secret regarding gardens?" the grandmother offered. "Yes, please. You absolutely cannot force a plant to grow," the grandmother stated plainly. "Nobody on earth can, not an emperor, not a holy man, not even a master farmer boasting 5 decades of dirt under his fingernails. A seedling matures strictly according to its own internal clock. The only thing we hold the power to do is care for it. We can guarantee it isn't thirsty. We can provide it with rich, dark soil. We can ensure aggressive weeds don't strangle its roots. We can stand right next to it, pay close attention to it, and actively wish it well. And then, entirely on its own schedule, it grows." The little girl stared down at the tiny lettuce leaves, her expression shifting to deep thought. "So, we aren't actually making them get bigger. No, sweetheart. We are merely creating a safe space for them to do it themselves." The child fell completely silent for several minutes. She tracked a tiny black ant scurrying across the border of a stepping stone. She soaked in the intense heat of the afternoon sun against the back of her neck. "Grandma," she finally murmured, "does that rule apply to human beings too?" The old woman beamed, reaching over to gently sweep a loose strand of hair behind the child's ear. "It applies especially to human beings, my dear, and especially to you." The warm summer rolled on. The child learned slowly the pleasure of doing less, of kneeling beside a plant without rushing it, of watering gently, of pulling a single weed and then pausing to look at the whole row, of standing up and simply watching the garden breathe. She learned to sit on the low stone bench at the end of the day and notice the pink sky above the far hills. She learned that the bees came and went on their own schedule, and that the plum tree did not need her opinion about when to fruit, and that the small birds could find their own worms without her help. She learned, in her quiet child's way, that gardening was not something you did to a garden, but rather something you did with it. There was one afternoon near the middle of that summer that the child would remember for the rest of her life. A sudden rain had come and gone, and the garden was glistening. The grandmother and the child were kneeling side by side, looking at the lettuce row, which had grown now into full, tender leaves. The child reached out very slowly and touched one of the leaves with a single fingertip. "Grandmother," she said quietly, "I think they knew we were being patient with them." The grandmother laughed softly, saying, "Perhaps they did, little one, perhaps they did." And the child felt for the first time in her young life the small and wonderful feeling of being in on a secret that the whole world somehow quietly shared. By the end of the summer, her grandmother's garden had grown lush and heavy with the last harvests, but something else had also grown more quietly. The child herself had grown slower, more watchful, and a little more patient with the plants, herself, and the world. On the last morning of her visit, the grandmother took her small hand and led her to the garden one final time as they stood together at the gate, looking out across the rows of green. "Little one," the grandmother said softly, "when you go home, the garden of your heart will also need tending, as it is the exact same work. You cannot make yourself grow faster, and you cannot make the harder parts of you disappear by shouting at them. All you can do is water yourself gently, clear a little space, and wait with kindness for what wants to grow." The child nodded, tears rising in her eyes for reasons she could not have named, and she never forgot it through all the long years of her life. This is the gentle quality of attention the Buddha and his students pointed to. It is not a forceful or demanding attention, but rather an attending attention that makes room for things. There is a beautiful Buddhist image sometimes offered for this quality. It is the image of cupping your hands around a small warm egg you have found, not knowing yet what is inside, not rushing it and not squeezing it, only keeping it safe and warm. This, the old Buddhist teachers would quietly say, is how we hold our own inner life, with gentle hands, a patient presence, and a soft willingness to let whatever is inside emerge in its own time. There is something freeing in this, because we do not have to make ourselves into anything. We do not have to push our hearts to be calmer than they currently are in this moment. We do not have to hurry our own healing, our own understanding, or our own quiet joy. We can simply tend, cupping the heart in our hands and trusting softly that what is good in us is already growing beneath the surface in its own good time. The Buddha himself compared the human heart to a lotus. Some lotuses, he said, are still deep beneath the water, their petals fully closed. Some are rising through the water, not yet at the surface. Some are just breaking into the open air, and some have bloomed full and bright in the morning sun. All of them are on the exact same journey, and all of them are beautiful at every stage. The one beneath the weight of the four is not less of a lotus. It is only in an earlier part of its own unfolding, and there is something deeply kind in this teaching. It says that wherever we find ourselves this evening, we are not behind and we are not ahead, we are exactly in our own season. The parts of us that feel tangled or tired or unfinished are not signs of failure. They are simply the leaves not yet opened, the blossom still folded inward, patient in its own quiet time. So it is with every one of us. Sometimes this evening you may find yourself wishing you were further along on some inner path, wishing you were calmer, freer, or more awake than you feel tonight. And when that small wishing arises, perhaps you can remember the grandmother at her garden gate. Perhaps you can cup your own heart just for a moment in gentle hands and let it be exactly as it is. Nothing is being pushed and nothing is being rushed, because you are both the garden and the gardener, and the summer sun is falling softly across both. Let us pause here easily, let the body grow a little softer, and let the breath slow. When you are ready, we will go on together. If you have ever tried to fall asleep by telling yourself very firmly that you must fall asleep right now, you already know something important about how the inner life works. The more forcefully you command yourself to sleep, the more stubbornly awake you become, and the harder you insist on feeling calm, the more restless the mind seems to grow. Something about the forcing itself pushes away the very thing you are desperately reaching for. The Buddha noticed this truth long ago and made it one of the gentle cornerstones of his teaching. He called it the middle way, and it is at heart the fine art of caring about something without grasping it. It is the art of effort without strain and steady attention held in quiet balance. Before his awakening, the Buddha himself had spent many years living as a very strict ascetic who ate almost nothing. He slept almost nothing, pushing himself to extreme limits, thinking that if he could only master his body and mind by sheer force, he would break through into liberation. Many others were with him in those days, all doing exactly the same. All of them were convinced that the harder the struggle, the closer the truth. But one morning, sitting by the side of a river, weakened and weary, he looked down into the water. The morning light was soft on the surface, and the river moved unhurried beside him, turning slowly around a bend. His face had grown thin, his body was bowed, and something inside him understood quietly that this was simply not the way. He remembered just then a moment from his childhood when he had been sitting in the cool shade of a rose apple tree while his father worked nearby in a field. The air had been fragrant, and a small breeze had moved the leaves above him. And without trying, without effort, and without anyone teaching him, a deep and natural peace had settled completely over him. He had simply been there, a small boy beneath a tree, and he had been purely happy. There is no freedom in the forcing, he thought to himself while watching the water. And there is no freedom in the giving up, so the truth must lie somewhere between. He accepted a small bowl of rice milk from a kind villager passing by, The warmth of it spread through his weakened body, and he sat down beneath a great tree. And for the first time in many long years, he allowed himself to simply be present without pushing, fighting, or collapsing. It was there, in that gentle balance, that the Buddha fully awakened. This middle way is not only a teaching for monks and forest masters, as it is meant for everyone. It is the quiet wisdom of how to hold absolutely anything precious. A difficult conversation, a tender hope, a young friendship, a simmering soup, a sleeping child, or a moment of silence at the end of a long day. Everything in life asks of us a certain kind of touch, not too tight and not too loose, just steady, warm, and perfectly present. Most of us, in our own way, have already tasted this. We know how it feels to grip something too hard and lose it. We know how it feels to neglect something and watch it quietly wither away. We live much of the time between these two poles, leaning wildly first one way, then the other. The middle way is the gentle center we are always returning to, sometimes without even knowing it. The Buddha gave one of his most beautiful teachings about this to a young student who had grown heavily discouraged. Let us sit with that small story for a bit. Let us explore a story about a young man who came to study with the Buddha long ago, and the kind question he received when his heart had grown terribly weary. Before he had become a seeker, he had been a highly gifted musician. He had played the lute beautifully at courts and in villages, and his music had been loved wherever he went. But he had come to feel over time that music alone was not enough to satisfy the deeper questions of his heart. And so he had set aside his instrument and come to sit at the feet of the Buddha. He was an earnest student who meditated for many hours each day, rising before dawn. He sat long into the night, pushing himself with great effort, quietly determined to arrive at what he was seeking. And for many months he felt that he was making real progress. But then, as sometimes happens, his heart grew completely discouraged. His sitting felt dry, his mind felt stubborn, and his body felt deeply tired. No matter how hard he tried, nothing inside seemed to soften. He watched the other students around him in the meditation hall, noticing that some of them seemed calm. Some of them seemed full of quiet joy, while others seemed to rest inside themselves with an ease he simply could not find. And the more he watched them, the more convinced he became that something was fundamentally wrong with him. He must not be trying hard enough, must not be disciplined enough, or must be missing some secret that the others had been given. And so he pushed himself harder, giving up sleep and giving up rest. He walked the paths of the monastery with tight shoulders and a rigidly tight jaw. He was determined through sheer force to break through, but the harder he pushed, the further the peace seemed to slip away. One morning, he came to the Buddha with tears rising in his eyes. "Master," he said, "I do not know what I am doing wrong, as I am trying as hard as I can. I am sitting longer, pushing through my tiredness, and working harder than anyone I know. But nothing is opening, and I feel further from the truth than when I began. Perhaps I am not made for this path," he worried. But the Buddha looked at him with great kindness and did not scold or correct him. He simply smiled softly and asked a gentle question. "Tell me," the Buddha said, "when you were a musician, do you remember how to tune your lute?" The young man looked up, surprised, and said, "Yes, master, of course. When you tuned the strings too tightly," the Buddha asked, "what would happen?" The young man thought for a moment and replied, "The strings would snap, master, as they could not hold such tension, and no music could come from them. And when the strings were too loose," the Buddha asked, "what would happen then?" The young man smiled a little, remembering, and said, "Then there was no music either, as the strings would simply hang there without voice, and I could pluck them, and only a dull sound would come." "And when the strings were just right?" the Buddha asked softly. "Then, master," the young man said, his eyes growing clearer, "the music was beautiful and almost effortless, and the strings sang as though they themselves wanted to sing." The Buddha nodded, and reached out, placing his hand very gently on the young man's shoulder. So it is with the effort of your practice, my friend, and so it is with the effort of your whole life. If you pull the strings of yourself too tight, you will snap. If you leave them too loose, there will be absolutely no music. But if you find the gentle middle where the heart is tuned neither too hard nor too soft, the music of your awakening will automatically rise of its own kind nature. The young man looked at the Buddha for a long moment. Something inside him, which had been painfully clenched for months, quietly relaxed. He bowed deeply, returned to his cushion, and sat down once more, but this time he did not push. He did not strain, but simply breathed, and as though it had been waiting patiently all along, the music began to beautifully rise in him. Later, on a warm evening, some weeks after that morning, he sat alone under a small tree and watched the first stars appearing one by one above the horizon. A soft wind moved through the grasses around him, and as he thought back to all his months of forcing, the early mornings of clenched effort, and the late nights of grim determination, he laughed very quietly to himself. He had come to the Buddha looking for some impossible technique, secret method, or exhausting path, and instead, the Buddha had simply given him back his own loot. This is the secret the Buddha offered his student that morning, and the same secret the Zen and Buddhist masters have been quietly offering ever since. Not too tight, not too loose, just enough care, just enough softness, and just enough trust that the music is already there and needs only gentle tuning to rise. The Buddha once told another image for this quality, an image of a fine goldsmith at her small fire. A fine goldsmith shaping a precious piece of gold does not hold it in the flame all day long, for the gold would burn and grow brittle. She does not pull it out and abandon it either, for it would harden and violently refuse to shape. She works with a quiet rhythm, a little heat, a little cooling, a little watching, tapping and pausing, and slowly, with immense patience, the gold becomes something luminous, something that could never have been forged by force nor by neglect. If you have ever watched someone at such careful work, you will quickly know there is a kind of peaceful attention on their face. They are not hurrying, they are not worried, and they are simply present to what is in front of them, checking its color, feeling its warmth, and listening to the small sounds it naturally makes. They have executed this work many times before, so they trust the process and they trust themselves. And because they trust, they do not push, which is how the Buddhist tradition invites us to hold our own inner life with the gentle attention of a goldsmith at her bench and the steady warmth of someone tending a small fire on a cool evening. Not too much, not too little, but a completely soft rhythm held with care. Sometimes in our own days we unfortunately forget this. We push ourselves too hard and blindly wonder why we feel so brittle. We let ourselves drift too long and wonder why absolutely nothing feels alive. We swing between forcing and giving up, losing the gentle middle where things actually manage to grow. Perhaps you have felt this in your own life, a certain tiredness that comes from trying too hard for too long, or a certain dullness that comes from having stopped trying altogether. It is a very human thing, and the Buddha never scolded his students for falling into these common patterns. He only, over and over, pointed back to the middle, to the steady warmth, to the soft attention, and to the kind of care that bends neither into severe strain nor into total neglect. And then sometimes in a quiet evening such as this one, we remember. We remember that the truest effort does not actually feel like effort at all, as it feels like care. It is the quiet tending we happily give to anything we genuinely love. It is the soft attention of a goldsmith who has done this work many times before and firmly trusts the fire, the gold, and her own steady hands. There is absolutely no hurry, and there is no need to push. The middle way is right here beneath every single breath, inviting us back into its gentle balance. So if you find your shoulders tight tonight, let them soften down. If your breath feels held, Let it release in its own perfect time. If your mind is pushing for some specific outcome, let it set that burden down just for now. This evening, not something to be earned, but rather something to be received. The strings of you do not need to be pulled tighter, and they do not need to be pulled looser. They are already beneath everything, tuned perfectly to the gentle music of this quiet hour. Let us pause here together, let the hands rest, and let the face soften. When the moment feels right, we will continue. Imagine for a moment a pool deeply situated in a forest, not a grand lake or a rushing stream, just a small, clear pool tucked quietly among the roots of old trees, gently fed by some underground spring. The sky is perfectly mirrored on its surface, and the tops of the tall pines reflect inside it as though they were growing upside down into another entire world. A single leaf falls and drifts lazily across the water. A small bird dips its beak at the muddy edge and drinks, and while the pool does nothing and simply is, everything naturally comes to it. This image lies at the absolute heart of one of the most beloved teachings in the Buddhist forest tradition. Passed down gently from one forest master to the next for many hundreds of years, it is a teaching so soft and unhurried that many people completely miss it on the first hearing. But when we sit with it long enough, it begins to slowly open something inside us that no amount of striving could have ever opened on its own. The teaching goes something like this. One of the great forest masters of Buddhism, after many years of living in the wild, said that the mind, when it is tended gently over time, becomes like a clear pool in the woods. And when the mind becomes such a pool, all manner of wonderful and extremely rare creatures begin to cautiously come to drink. The fears we have long buried come softly to the edge of the water. The griefs we have quietly carried come to drink, along with tender memories, small forgotten joys, and unexpected insights that all begin to step out from the forest of our inner life and show themselves unafraid at the water's edge. And if we are still enough and patient enough, we get to witness all of them. We see the truth of our own mind, the forest master said with immense peace. But he added something extremely important. You cannot physically force the pool to become still. You cannot shout at the water and command it to immediately settle. You cannot wave your hands over its surface and blindly insist that the reflections be clear. The pool becomes still only when it is totally left alone, when nothing is being thrown into it, and when no one is actively stirring it. And so it is, the Buddhist tradition tells us, with the human heart. J. Tao sao no not fan koi chamai, lien mak một khối không cách dòng, lấy mà dùng. Let's explore a tale regarding two beloved old companions who reunited after decades apart next to a pristine pool inside an ancient woodland. They had been raised together in the exact same little town as little girls. They shared dreams, giggled together, and strolled to their classes side by side. However, existence eventually pulled them down separate paths. One of them got married, labored intensely, raised her kids, and became thoroughly entangled in the frantic pace of her expanding community. The other woman had been pulled, ever since she was very young, toward the profound silence of the wilderness. She relocated to the boundary of a vast forest, occupying a tiny timber cabin next to an ancient Buddhist monument that locals had cared for across multiple generations. In that place, her lifestyle was incredibly basic. She simply sat. She paid attention to the breezes rustling the pine needles. Countless years drifted by. Meanwhile, the companion living in the bustling town became completely exhausted by her endless tasks. She hadn't totally lost her direction, but she had certainly lost fragments of her own soul. Her daily schedule had become suffocatingly packed. Her nights felt far too brief. She realized with a wave of silent sorrow that her own mind had not been genuinely peaceful for an incredibly long era. During late autumn one specific year, she penned a letter to her old friend stating, "Could I possibly visit and remain with you for a brief period? I am not entirely sure what I require, "But I strongly believe I need exactly what you possess," her companion immediately sent a reply saying, "Please come." She finally reached the forest's edge following a grueling trip, where her friend greeted her on the dirt trail, grabbed her luggage, and guided her silently toward the modest wooden cabin. For the initial couple of days, the two women just sat next to one another. They prepared basic dishes. They went on brief strolls through the surrounding trees. The visiting companion constantly waited for an intense spiritual lesson to kick off. She waited for her friend to utter something profound, to hand her a magical phrase that would magically untangle the mess inside her chest. Yet absolutely nothing happened, just pure silence. The snapping of the tiny kitchen fire and the audio of the wind brushing against the tree limbs. On the morning of the fourth day, the forest dweller murmured softly, "Follow me. I want to show you a specific place." She guided her guest down a tranquil, twisting trail straight into the densest sector of the woods. They hiked for roughly 60 minutes. The timber grew much taller. The sunlight became significantly dimmer. Finally, within a tiny open space, they stumbled upon a natural pool. It wasn't a majestic landmark. It was strictly a circular, transparent puddle of water, sustained by a tiny spring dripping from a rocky edge. Green moss clung to the bordering stones. Massive trees arched carefully above the surface. The water rested so motionless that the sky above was flawlessly reflected across its face. Fluffy cloud, a lone bird gliding at a high altitude, the intricate web of naked branches contrasting against the light blue atmosphere. "Here is the pool," her companion announced. "What pool?" the guest inquired, totally bewildered. "The specific one I visit every single morning. The exact spot that has educated me far better than any human guru." The guest stared blankly at the water, anticipating a magical event. The forest resident lowered herself onto a tiny rock next to the edge and rested, her folded hands in her lap. "Just sit beside it for a bit," she instructed plainly. So the visiting companion took a seat. Initially, she felt incredibly fidgety. Her internal monologue was deafening. She constantly wondered when they were going to head back to the cabin. She obsessively reviewed a mental checklist of chores she had abandoned back in her town. She mentally replayed minor annoyances from her chaotic daily routine. The body of water appeared to be just regular water. The surrounding timber seemed like standard timber. However, her companion sat so peacefully right next to her, and the wilderness was so profoundly silent, that very gradually, almost resisting the urge, she started to calm down. A full hour ticked by, or maybe even longer. The concept of time itself became blurry inside that hidden clearing. A tiny bird landed near the pool's rim, dunked its beak a couple of times, and fluttered gracefully into the air. A timid doe emerged from the timber on the opposite edge of the open space. The animal stared at the two humans across the pond for a lengthy period, showing zero fear, before dipping her snout to hydrate. The pool's surface vibrated outward with every single gentle lap of the animal's tongue. Once finished, the deer pivoted and casually strolled back into the dense woods without a hint of panic. A bright blue dragonfly touched down on an adjacent leaf, rested for the span of a single breath, and took off. And the visiting companion, without consciously deciding to do so, started shedding tears. It wasn't a violent sobbing, it was a gentle, purifying weeping, identical to rain finally soaking into the dirt, following a brutal drought. A tight, ancient knot inside her chest was ultimately unraveling. Her woodland friend simply reached over, completely speechless, and rested a comforting hand firmly between her shoulder blades. After a considerable wait, the guest murmured, "What exactly is occurring inside me?" Her companion offered a silent smile. "The water is merely doing its job," she explained. "It is allowing your body to find stillness." "But I haven't actively done a single thing," the guest replied in total confusion. "Exactly," her friend responded tenderly. "That is the entire secret to this. They remained seated together until the sunlight drifted across the opening and started casting golden rays through the foliage. Neither woman uttered another syllable. There was absolutely nothing left that required saying. Over the subsequent days, the guest started hiking to the water entirely by herself. Her host made no effort to block her. She merely grinned every single morning as she watched the woman strapping on her hiking sandals near the cabin's entrance. "Travel softly," her companion would advise. "Don't rush yourself." And the guest would navigate the silent, zigzagging dirt trail deep into the heart of the woods, just to sit next to the water. Occasionally she lingered for 60 minutes, sometimes drastically longer. She carried absolutely zero items with her. She refused to read books. She ceased making schedules. She exclusively sat. Throughout those tranquil days, she started observing that her personal mindset was gradually beginning to reflect the actual pool. Her thoughts continued to arrive just as the breezes continued to weave through the timber. Minor anxieties, fading memories, fragile hopes, but they no longer appeared to agitate her internal waters the way they previously did. They glided across the surface of her attention, made brief contact, and vanished. One particular afternoon, while resting alone near the edge, she detected a subtle sensation she had never previously registered. A gentle joy, perfectly quiet yet completely full, expanding inside her chest. There was zero logic to it, and absolutely zero trigger. It was merely present, acting as if it had been patiently hiding beneath the chaotic noise of her normal routine, finally receiving adequate silence to float to the top. She let out a soft laugh while tears brimmed in her eyes. She chose not to mention this to her companion that evening. Certain experiences simply don't require verbal explanation. By the time she traveled back to her frantic town, a couple of weeks later, a fundamental shift had occurred within her. Her daily obligations hadn't magically vanished. Her endless task lists hadn't shrunk at all. Her schedule remained just as suffocating as it was prior to the trip. However, a piece of her soul had figured out exactly how to retreat, repeatedly, back to that pristine internal pool, resting underneath all the chaos. And during the most brutal shifts, whenever her internal waters felt violently agitated, she would shut her eyelids for a mere second and visualize the timid doe emerging from the timber, the blue dragonfly resting on the foliage, and the comforting heat of her friend's palm against her spine. Then, her mental pool would commence settling down at an incredibly slow pace. That is the tender offering of the woodland pond, and the tender offering provided by the Buddhist forest lineage itself. We aren't required to physically labor for peace. We don't need to construct it, purchase it, or aggressively muscle our way inside it. We merely need to cease aggressively agitating the waters of our own existence for a brief period. We solely need to take a seat, inhale deeply, and permit things to be, and whatever genuinely needs to float to the top, whatever desperately needs to be acknowledged, whatever requires gentle maintenance, naturally starts showing up entirely on its own, completely fearless, and without us actively hunting it down. The Buddha personally addressed this concept with immense affection. He declared that once the human mind achieves clarity, it transforms into an ally for every living creature. This isn't because the brain traveled to a magical destination to find that clarity, but simply because a mind that is left undisturbed will naturally calm down, naturally filter itself, and naturally become softer. It is the inherent instinct of water to revert back to a motionless state, and that happens to be our inherent instinct as well. We have spent so much time aggressively churning our internal pools that we have practically convinced ourselves that the constant churning is the sole factor keeping our minds functioning. Yet, agitated water isn't somehow more vibrant. Agitated water is strictly murky. Motionless water serves as a sanctuary for countless elements. The surrounding trees mirror perfectly across it. The expansive sky resides inside it. The timid animals approach its edges for hydration. All of these miracles occur simply because the water is peaceful enough to accept them. Tonight, you are being formally welcomed to visit your own personal woodland pool, not a physical location elsewhere. Right there inside your own ribcage, within your personal breathing rhythm, during the gentle expansion and contraction of this peaceful hour, you aren't required to perform a single task to achieve stillness. You simply must stop tossing extra debris into your water for a short break. Quit mentally practicing for tomorrow's events. Cease fighting mental battles against yesterday's mistakes. Quit shoving against the top layer of your consciousness with endless petty requirements. And very gradually, strictly on its own schedule, the water will calm. And within the profound silence that arrives next, a miraculous process initiates. The tiny birds approach. The timid deer emerge from the timberline. The gentle realities of your own existence, exact truths you had practically wiped from your memory, will step up to the water's boundary and take a sip. Let's take a pause right here for a single inhale. Allow your brain to act as a tranquil pond just for this specific second. There is absolutely no rush. Whenever you feel prepared, we shall move forward. Picture a tiny glass prism sitting silently on the windowsill of an ancient timber room. The early morning sunlight angles directly through the glass panes and makes contact with that prism. Instantly, a delicate spectrum of shades materializes on the adjacent drywall: red, orange, yellow, green, blue, and violet. Every single one of them splashed across the surface, peaceful and motionless, born from one solitary beam of pure white illumination. It represents a tiny miracle, a phenomenon we practically ignore because we've witnessed it countless times throughout our existence. A colorful rainbow trapped in an oily puddle following a storm, an unexpected ribbon of shades curving across the overcast sky. That little piece of glass on the ledge, silently splitting the sunshine into its numerous concealed identities. What the vast majority of people fail to realize while observing this is that those specific colors existed within that bright beam the entire time. They were hiding inside the morning dawn. They were present during the blistering noon heat. They existed inside every single sunbeam that has ever warmed our flesh. The glass prism didn't magically manufacture them. It merely provides them a brief opportunity to become visually apparent. Buddhist lineages have utilized this exact metaphor delicately for countless decades to describe an enlightened soul. Whenever the average person initially encounters the term awakening, they assume it has to manifest in one extremely specific manner. We visualize a profound internal tranquility, or an immense mute happiness, or a sprawling infinite empathy. And simply because we anticipate experiencing it in one exact format, we frequently overlook all the alternative methods it is currently using to blossom inside of us. Zen and Buddhist teachers offer a gentle smile regarding this habit. They have understood for eras that an enlightened spirit does not consist of just one single flavor. They suggest it resembles a peaceful garden filled with tiny blossoms. Every single bloom looks gorgeous during its specific season. Every bud is slightly unique compared to its neighbors, yet they all sprout from the identical nurturing dirt. Occasionally, the enlightened spirit manifests as pure, silence, delicate and expansive, harboring absolutely zero desire to speak. Other times, it manifests as a muted sense of thankfulness, welling up without any logical trigger, perhaps just while sipping a warm mug of tea. Frequently, it emerges as a massive wave of affection directed at the entire globe, toward random pedestrians on the sidewalk, toward the tiny critters bordering your yard, or even directed at your own reflection staring back from a glass mirror. Sometimes it arrives in the form of absolute clarity, acting as if a puzzle that had baffled you for years suddenly became painfully obvious. Occasionally, it takes the form of a minor chuckle bubbling up from the center of your ribs, purely reacting to the beautiful sweetness of merely existing. Every single one of these instances represents the rainbow. All of these variations are the exact same illumination filtering through the glass prism of a specific moment, a specific inhale, or a specific soul. And not a single one of these variations represents a better enlightened state than the others. Let's dive into a tale regarding a youthful searcher who showed up at a tranquil Buddhist temple many eras ago, overflowing with sincere inquiries regarding the enlightened spirit. He was an intelligent young fellow, desperate to comprehend the universe. He had spent countless months obsessively reading, pondering, and wandering the roads, actively hunting for the perfect gurus. Upon arriving at this specific compound, perched high up on a lush mountain slope right next to an ancient orchard of plum trees, he prayed that he would finally be handed one definitive, crystal-clear response to the dilemma that had haunted his footsteps for years. What exactly does an enlightened spirit physically feel like? He solely desired that single, factual response so he could accurately recognize it the moment he stumbled across it. During his very first sunrise there, he walked up to a resident who was brushing the stone courtyard. This man possessed a serene, mute expression, and the youthful searcher felt magnetically pulled toward the gentle peace radiating from him. "Respected elder," he began, offering a deep bow, "would it be acceptable to ask you something?" "Certainly," the sweeper replied, resting his weight against the broom handle. "What does an enlightened soul actually feel like the moment you genuinely connect with it? What is the specific sensation?" The resident froze for an extended duration. He carefully observed a tiny sparrow touch down on the paving stones before bouncing out of sight. "Absolute silence," he eventually declared. "In my personal experience, it is pure silence. A delicate, expansive quietness possessing zero boundaries, feeling exactly as if the entire planet simultaneously let out a massive, gentle exhale." The young searcher expressed his gratitude and locked that response deep inside his chest. Silence, excellent. Maybe that was the exact sensation he had been hunting for this entire time. However, later that exact same morning, he crossed paths with an entirely different residenter, much older man strolling sluggishly through the floral garden. The youthful searcher walked up to this elder, executing the identical bow and posing the identical inquiry. "What exactly does an enlightened spirit feel like?" The elderly man let out a soft chuckle. He possessed incredibly warm eyes surrounded by dozens of deep wrinkles. "For my personal journey, my youthful companion," he answered, "the sensation is pure thankfulness. A deep gratitude bubbling up without a single logical trigger. I might just be standing near the cooking fire, slicing a tiny root vegetable, and suddenly I am overwhelmed with thankfulness, simply to be breathing. Thankful for the sharp blade gripped in my palm. Thankful for the yielding timber making up my chopping block. Deeply thankful for the sunbeams angling through the glass panes. I occasionally shed a few tears over it. Just a foolish old man." The young searcher offered a smile, though he felt incredibly bewildered. Pure silence versus overwhelming gratitude. Which specific emotion was the legitimate one? Later that afternoon, he encountered a third resident, a bald female possessing mute, highly observant eyes. She was resting on a rock slab right under a blossoming plum tree, staring blankly into the distance. He offered his bow. "Could I possibly present you with the identical inquiry I've been asking everyone else? If you don't mind, what exactly does the enlightened spirit feel like?" She analyzed him for a brief second and beamed. "It feels precisely like true vision, little one. Absolute visual clarity. During one specific second, I might be entirely baffled. The very next second, that baffling fog instantly evaporates, and I am staring directly at reality without a single trace of mist blocking my view. That is exactly how it manifests for my soul. Unobstructed vision, a subtle, wonderful return to absolute reality." At this point, the youthful searcher was completely mystified. 3 different residents had supplied 3 contradictory answers. absolute silence, overwhelming thankfulness, and unobstructed vision. How on earth could an enlightened soul represent all three of these contradictory states simultaneously? He trudged back toward his tiny sleeping quarters near the compound's boundary, obsessively tumbling the dilemma around inside his skull. Was a specific resident vastly more spiritually evolved than the rest? Was one of them significantly closer to the actual facts? Or was the fundamental truth constructed from multiple fragments, requiring him to piece them all together like a meticulous carpenter, aligning each segment perfectly next to its neighbor? He simply couldn't deduce the solution, regardless of how intensely he analyzed the data. His skull started to throb softly from the sheer weight of his own overthinking. As night approached, exhausted and feeling rather defeated, he hiked up a narrow dirt trail leading to the absolute peak of the mountain, a place where locals claimed the most ancient elder of the compound resided solo inside a tiny timber shack. Rumors stated this ancient man possessed terrifying wisdom, rarely uttered a single syllable, and was profoundly cherished by every soul who crossed his path. The hike was incredibly vertical, zigzagging through dense pine trees that dropped needles to cushion every single boot step. The fading sunlight cast a comforting heat against the young searcher's spine. Down below in the valley, a tiny bronze bell chimed softly to announce the arriving dusk. His internal pulse, which had been racing frantically all afternoon with endless queries, started decelerating as he gained altitude. By the exact moment he arrived at the miniature timber cabin at the summit, his breathing was completely mute, his posture was relaxed, and his burning dilemmas had shrunk significantly in size. They were no longer screaming for attention, merely whispering. The youthful searcher tapped delicately on the timber entrance. The ancient elder pulled it open at a snail's pace. He was an incredibly tiny, skeletal man, sporting a tender, welcoming grin and piercing black eyes. "Please enter. Step right in," he invited. The young searcher crossed the threshold. The interior was incredibly sparse. It contained just a tiny resting pad on the floorboards, a timber cup resting on a short ledge, one solitary glass pane pointing toward the setting sun, and sitting right there on the ledge was a miniature glass prism capturing the final golden beams of the dying afternoon. The ancient elder motioned for him to take a seat. The young searcher offered a bow, sat down and organized his racing thoughts. "Honored elder," he began, "I have sought you out specifically because my mind is in knots. I approached 3 separate residents this afternoon to ask what an enlightened soul actually feels like, and every single one of them handed me a contradictory response. The first claimed pure silence, the next claimed overwhelming thankfulness, and the last claimed unobstructed vision. I desperately need to figure out which specific person is stating the facts." The ancient elder offered a delicate smile. He refused to provide an immediate verbal reply. Instead, he pivoted sluggishly toward the glass pane and extended 2 bony fingers. He pinched the miniature glass prism and cradled it gingerly against his exposed palm. "Step over here," he instructed. "Take a seat directly next to me." The youthful searcher closed the distance. The fading sunlight sat extremely low against the horizon, radiating a comforting golden hue, and it struck the elder's wrinkled skin exactly where the glass shape sat. "Observe this closely," the old man directed, rotating the glass a fraction of an inch. "Pay attention to the result." The young searcher stared intently as a delicate spectrum of vivid colors materialized directly on the timber floorboards next to their knees. Red, orange, yellow, green, blue, and violet. Every single shade was peaceful and motionless, birthed from one solitary beam of faded golden illumination. "Explain something to me," the ancient elder whispered gently. "Which specific shade represents the actual sunbeam?" The youthful searcher stared down at the scattered colors, and a tiny spark of comprehension started to ignite inside his ribcage. "Every single one of them, honored elder, They collectively represent the sunbeam. The ancient elder grinned and placed a feather-light palm against the young man's spine. Exactly correct. Your three peers residing at this compound have all spoken the absolute facts to you. The first individual perceives the silent aspect of that illumination. The second perceives the thankful aspect of that illumination. The last individual perceives the absolute clarity of that identical illumination. However, they are all staring at the exact same beam, that solitary ray of truth filtering through their individual souls, revealing itself in the exact specific shade that their unique spirit is currently capable of processing. The youthful searcher remained completely mute for an extended period, while the vibrant spectrum on the floorboards slowly dissolved along with the vanishing sun. Therefore, the ancient elder whispered incredibly softly, "You must stop trying to deduce which specific shade represents the enlightened soul, little one. You must merely pray that the core illumination, regardless of the specific tint it selects, continues to drop by and visit you delicately, repeatedly, entirely on its own schedule and through its own unique methods." The Buddha personally delivered this exact lesson using his own phrasing on numerous occasions. He likened the enlightened brain to a cloudless atmosphere. He likened it to a motionless pond. He likened it to a fully blossomed water lily and to an oil flame that refuses to dance in the wind. A variety of metaphors, yet every single one directs attention back to the exact same illumination. And this translates into something incredibly liberating for every single human. It implies that the brief, peaceful pauses we currently experience, the minor surges of affection, those tiny, delicate moments of vulnerability, they are not somehow inferior to the massive, explosive enlightenment we might have daydreamed about. They literally are the enlightenment, merely manifesting in the specific shade our soul is currently equipped to process during this exact chapter of our existence. Certain individuals feel most comfortable wrapped in total silence. Others discover their personal entrance through acts of pure generosity. Some individuals truly wake up when practicing thankfulness. Others unlock their internal doors most effortlessly by experiencing a massive, tender awe regarding the incredibly mundane aspects of reality. Every single one of these paths represents the core illumination. All of them are the identical, basic reality that the Buddha gestured toward while sitting beneath his giant timber so many centuries in the past. And not a single one is incorrect. Not a single one is a runner-up prize. Not one of them represents an inferior tint. Consequently, as the lessons of this current night drift softly toward their conclusion, maybe it isn't completely necessary to definitively pick which specific stripe of the spectrum belongs to you. Maybe it is entirely adequate to simply feel that the illumination is already filtering directly through your chest, has literally always been filtering through your chest, and is currently, even during this brief hushed hour, silently splashing its delicate shades right across the floorboards of your personal existence. Buddhist lineages occasionally refer to every human being as a tiny, heated sanctuary housing an entity that is incredibly ancient and overwhelmingly benevolent, resting in a state of quiet alertness. We did not personally construct that sanctuary. We did not actively inject that benevolence inside it. Those elements have resided there since the very beginning, patiently holding out hope that we might eventually walk in and take a seat right next to them. This very night, maybe you have managed to pull your chair a fraction closer to them than you were 60 minutes prior. That progress is adequate. That level of progress is permanently adequate. Let's take a delicate pause right here. Relax completely inside whichever specific shade decided to drop by your mind tonight. Whenever you feel adequately prepared, we shall wrap things up as a group. And just like that, we gently arrive at the finale of our shared peaceful hour. Deep down inside your memory right now, Maybe there are tiny mental snapshots lingering from tonight's journey. A traveling holy man resting beneath timber on the fringes of a high-altitude settlement. A pair of youthful nuns sharing a giggle inside a cramped room packed with orphans. A dark silhouette leaping across a pale fabric wall. A fruit tree bursting with white petals next to a weathered fence. An elderly matriarch and her young descendant crouching in the dirt next to baby salad greens. A youthful lute player finally recalling the proper tension for his strings. A motionless pond hidden in old-growth timber, where a timid deer emerges from the shadows to hydrate. A miniature piece of angled glass on a window ledge, splashing colorful rays across timber planks. All of these are merely fictional narratives. They do not represent the absolute factual reality. However, every single one of them, using its own subtle method, gestures delicately toward a concept that is undeniably real. That profound quietness that has eternally existed right here. The delicate compassion buried beneath your daily routine. That heated, enlightened spirit you've been hauling around in total ignorance ever since you were a toddler. Absolutely nothing you absorb tonight actually requires active memorization. Whatever holds genuine truth will automatically drift back into your consciousness entirely on its own schedule. It might arrive as a fleeting mental picture, a recognizable quote, or a sudden surge of heat you can't accurately label. That is exactly how these ancient Buddhist lessons have operated seamlessly for millennia, delicately, sluggishly, and demanding absolutely zero strenuous labor. I hope your brain finds absolute peace tonight. I hope your physical form completely relaxes. I hope your spirit feels deeply protected. Have a wonderful sleep, and I appreciate you tuning in to join us on this journey.